I never imagined a few words on a screen could destroy my entire world, but there it was, glaring at me like a cruel joke. I'm leaving you. For her. My hands trembled as I read it again, desperate for some mistake, a glitch, anything that would undo the betrayal spelled out in cold text. But the truth was undeniable. The man I loved, the man I trusted with my heart and my future, had chosen someone else. Someone I called my best friend. The phone slipped from my fingers, hitting the floor with a soft thud that echoed in the empty room. My breath caught. My vision blurred. And then, a second message arrived. I'm taking everything. The company, the house, the life we built. You're done. The room spun. I sank to the floor, the harsh sting of loss crushing me. But even as the darkness threatened to swallow me whole, a voice inside whispered, "This isn't the end. It's the beginning of my revenge. Because I am coming back. Stronger. Unstoppable. And this time, the game is mine." The cold linoleum floor bit into my skin through the thin fabric of my blouse as I curled into myself, trying to hold together the shards of a life shattered in seconds. The harsh fluorescent lights overhead hummed quietly, indifferent to the chaos unfolding beneath them. Outside, rain splattered against the window pane, streaking cold droplets down the glass like tears I was too broken to shed. I wanted to scream. To rage. To throw something. Anything against the walls that had witnessed my slow unraveling. But my body betrayed me. It was heavy, defeated, hollow. I was alone, or so I thought. For 5 years I had stood by his side, Jonathan Blake, as his partner, his wife, his confidant. Together, we'd built Blake Technologies from a 2-person startup into a thriving empire. I had sacrificed late nights, personal dreams, and friendships to support our vision. I had believed in us, but love had been a lie, and friendship a mask. The sting of betrayal was not just the loss of Jonathan's love, it was the realization that Cynthia, my closest friend, had been the architect of my ruin all along. The woman who knew my fears, my hopes, who had sat beside me during late-night talks, had smiled behind my back as she stole everything. My phone buzzed again, a cruel reminder that life was moving forward without me. I wiped my trembling hands on my skirt and stared at the screen. You'll never see this coming. The company is mine now. I pressed the power button and the screen went dark. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Flashbacks came unbidden. The day we signed the papers. Jonathan's proud smile as he held my hand. The promises whispered in the quiet of our first office, a cramped, sunlit space filled with hope. Our first product launch, the sleepless nights spent coding, designing, strategizing. The celebrations when we landed our first major client. I remembered the spark in Jonathan's eyes when he spoke about the future. His dreams intertwining with mine like threads of gold. But somewhere between ambition and success, the threads unraveled. I remembered the subtle changes. The way his phone would buzz, and he'd glance at it with a guilty expression. The unexplained business trips that didn't quite add up. The tension that filled rooms where laughter once lived. And then, the night I found them. I had returned early from a client meeting, hoping to surprise Jonathan with dinner. Instead, the sight that greeted me shattered my heart. Jonathan and Cynthia, entwined in a way that belonged only to lovers. I'd turned away before tears could fall, my breath caught in my throat, the betrayal searing like fire. I left that night without a word. My best friend, my husband, they had become strangers. The divorce papers came months later. Cold, clinical, ruthless. Jonathan had taken everything, including the company we built. I was left with nothing but the ashes of a life I no longer recognized. But as I sat on that floor, the embers of rage began to burn. I would rise. I would return, and I would take back what was stolen. The hospital room smelled sterile, antiseptic and hope mingling in the air. The accident had been brutal, a reckless driver, wet roads, and a collision that should have killed me. But fate had other plans. As I lay there, broken and fragile, memories flooded back, not just of loss, but of a promise whispered to myself in the darkest hours. This was not the end. It was a second chance. A rebirth. I opened my eyes to a world changed and a woman transformed. Stronger. Wiser. More determined than ever. The fight for my life had been brutal, but the fight for my future was just beginning. I was coming back, not as the broken wife left in the dust, but as the CEO of Blake Technologies, and the woman who would make Jonathan and Cynthia regret ever crossing me. The first time I looked in the mirror after waking up from the coma, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. The bruises had faded, the stitches healed, but the reflection was more than physical change. It was a soul remade, tempered by pain, sharpened by betrayal, and fueled by an unquenchable fire. Gone was the girl who had trusted blindly. Gone was the woman who begged for love that was never hers to keep. In her place stood a force no one, not Jonathan, not Cynthia, not even fate itself, could ignore. I traced the jagged scar on my cheek with trembling fingers. It was a permanent reminder of that night, of how close I had come to death. But scars, I decided, were not just marks of pain. They were proof of survival. A survival I intended to honor. Months after the accident, I emerged from the hospital with a single mission: reclaim everything I had lost. But the path was treacherous. Blake Technologies had changed hands. Jonathan's name was stamped on every contract, every press release, every client meeting invitation. The company he once built with me was now his kingdom, and I was the forgotten ghost. Yet every empire has cracks, every fortress a weakness, and Jonathan's reign was no exception. I started small, researching, gathering intel, finding allies within the company who remembered the woman behind the boardroom doors, the employees who had seen the passion in my eyes during all-nighters, the strategic brilliance in my plans, the dedication that had powered Blake's rise. One by one, I rebuilt my network, speaking softly but firmly to those who still believed in me. Quiet conversations over coffee, late-night emails, discreet meetings in dimly lit cafes. The pieces of my comeback were falling into place. I had learned something vital in those months. Revenge was not just about anger. It was about patience, strategy, power. I immersed myself in the company's financials, contracts, and legal documents. I studied the weaknesses in Jonathan's control, overlooked clauses, shareholder dissatisfaction, regulatory oversights. I hired the best legal minds discreetly, ensuring every move was calculated, every decision deliberate. At night, I lay awake, drafting plans, envisioning the moment I would walk back into Blake Technologies' headquarters, not as a woman abandoned, but as its rightful leader. Yet, this journey was not just about business. It was personal. Jonathan and Cynthia had shattered my trust, but I was determined not to be defined by their betrayal. I began attending therapy, digging deep into the wounds they had left. The sessions were painful but necessary. I uncovered layers of self-doubt, fear, and unspoken anger that had lurked beneath my composed exterior. I learned to channel that anger into strength, to transform pain into purpose. Friends who had drifted away returned cautiously, sensing the change in me. Some were skeptical. Could the woman they once knew truly rise from such devastation? Others were inspired, drawn to the fire that now burned brighter than ever. One evening, as I walked the quiet streets of the city, the autumn leaves crunching beneath my heels, I reflected on how much had changed. The woman who had sat on the cold floor with her phone dropped forgotten was gone. Ahead of me stretched a path fraught with challenges, battles, and risks. But I was ready to reclaim my life. Ready to take back Blake Technologies, ready to confront Jonathan and Cynthia, and show them that the woman they tried to destroy was now the storm they feared most. The boardroom was no longer just a place of business. It was a battlefield. And I was prepared to fight for every inch. The towering glass facade of Blake Technologies' headquarters gleamed under the early morning sun, reflecting the city's pulse and power. From a distance, it looked like an impenetrable fortress, sleek, modern, and utterly unyielding. Inside those walls, decisions were made that rippled through industries, influenced markets, and shaped futures. It was the kingdom Jonathan now ruled. But today, for the first time in 5 years, I was no longer the forgotten ghost. I was an invader. A queen reclaiming her throne. I studied the building carefully before stepping inside. The security guards barely glanced at me as I swiped the temporary badge I had arranged weeks before through discreet channels. It granted me limited access, enough to move through common areas, but not the executive floors. Yet it was a start. Each step echoed softly in the marble lobby, mixing with the muted buzz of employees starting their day. Faces passed me, some curious, some indifferent. I caught a few glances of recognition, but no acknowledgement. The message was clear: I was an outsider. A threat they weren't yet willing to confront. I let them believe that. Because the first rule of battle was patience. My first destination was the company cafeteria. It was a hub of conversation and gossip, the heartbeat of internal politics. I found a quiet corner, unpacked my laptop, and began sifting through the information I had painstakingly gathered. Employee records, recent board minutes, financial reports, and the subtle fractures that had begun to appear under Jonathan's rule. Rumors of disgruntled shareholders had reached me, whispers of missed opportunities, leadership doubts, and dissatisfaction with Jonathan's increasingly erratic decisions. The company's growth had plateaued, and key clients had started asking difficult questions. This was my opening. I reached out discreetly to a few trusted contacts still loyal to me. Employees who had once admired my leadership and questioned Jonathan's direction. Over the next few days, secret meetings followed, in cafes, hotel lobbies, and even after hours within the company itself. Sarah, a sharp and ambitious senior manager, became my first real ally. She had been overlooked for promotion and deeply frustrated with the current leadership's lack of vision. "We need a change," she whispered during one meeting, her eyes blazing with determination. "The board is restless. Your name still carries weight. They want stability. You could give them that." Her words fueled my resolve. Back at home, I transformed my spare room into a war room, whiteboards filled with plans, timelines, and key players. I studied every document, every contract, every clause that might tilt the balance in my favor. I hired financial analysts and legal experts to comb through the company's filings. We uncovered vulnerabilities, agreements Jonathan had hastily signed, shareholder disagreements, and breaches of protocol that could be leveraged. But beyond the paperwork, I prepared myself mentally and physically. Days of therapy had taught me to master my emotions, to steel myself against the ghosts of my past. I began working with a personal trainer, rebuilding my strength and endurance. Each drop of sweat was a declaration. I was ready for whatever battle lay ahead. Then came the first breakthrough. An anonymous tip led me to a small but influential group of shareholders dissatisfied with Jonathan's leadership. They had grown wary of his increasingly erratic behavior and were eager for change, but lacked a clear alternative. With Sarah's help, I arranged a confidential meeting with them. The room was tense, filled with sharp suits and skeptical eyes. But when I spoke, not as a victim, but as a leader, something shifted. I presented a clear, compelling vision for Blake Technologies' future, one grounded in innovation, stability, and integrity. I reminded them of the company's roots and the values Jonathan had betrayed. By the end of the meeting, I had their cautious support. Word began to spread quietly but steadily. Whispers of my return stirred the halls of Blake Technologies. Jonathan grew restless, his phone calls to key board members increasing in frequency. I sensed his paranoia. He knew the tides were turning, but I was no longer the woman who had fled in silence. I was the storm on the horizon. One evening, as I sat alone in my war room, the city skyline glowing through the window, a familiar notification popped up on my phone. "Jonathan Blake has scheduled a meeting with the board tomorrow." A smirk touched my lips. The battle was about to begin, and this time, I was ready to win. The morning light filtered softly through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Blake Technologies' boardroom. The room was imposing, a polished mahogany table stretched nearly 30 feet long, surrounded by leather chairs that looked more like thrones. The cityscape outside glittered with promise and power, but inside, tension hung thick in the air. Today was not just another meeting, it was a reckoning. I arrived early, dressed in a tailored black suit that fit like armor. The fabric was sharp, the cut perfect, a silent statement that I had returned not as a wounded wife, but as a force to be reckoned with. As I entered, eyes turned toward me, a mixture of surprise, disbelief, and, for some, a flicker of respect. Jonathan sat at the far end of the table, his posture stiff, eyes narrowed like a cornered wolf. His fingers drummed nervously on the tabletop. Across from him, board members whispered among themselves, their gazes flickering between us like spectators waiting for a duel. I held my head high and took my seat deliberately, not asking, not waiting for permission. This was my place. The chairman of the board, Mr. Harrington, cleared his throat and called the meeting to order. The agenda was brief, but the undercurrents were anything but. Jonathan opened with a presentation that was rehearsed but lacked conviction. His vision for the company was shaky, marred by recent losses and questionable strategies. I listened quietly, letting the room absorb his faltering confidence. Then it was my turn. I stood, letting the weight of the moment settle over me. Every eye was on me. Some skeptical, some curious, others perhaps fearful of the woman who had vanished and now returned like a tempest. I began with the company's history, the dream Jonathan and I had once shared, the foundation of integrity and innovation we had built. I reminded them of our successes, but more importantly, I acknowledged the fractures under current leadership. With calm precision, I laid out the evidence, the financial missteps, the faltering client relationships, the internal unrest. I presented a comprehensive plan for restructuring, growth, and renewed innovation, one rooted in transparency, strong governance, and a clear vision. Throughout, I spoke not as a woman seeking revenge, but as a leader reclaiming her responsibility. The room shifted. The air grew charged. Jonathan's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with anger as I methodically dismantled his narrative. When I finished, there was a heavy silence, the kind that precedes a storm. Mr. Harrington leaned forward, addressing the board directly. Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence presented is compelling. The company's trajectory under Mr. Blake's sole leadership has indeed raised concerns. It is clear we need a change. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Jonathan's face darkened. He opened his mouth, but no words came. His power, once absolute here, was waning. Votes were called. The tension was palpable. Every hand raised felt like a victory carved from years of pain. When the final count was announced, the room erupted in a mix of cheers and stunned silence. I was appointed interim CEO. As the meeting adjourned, Jonathan stormed past me without a word, his eyes burning with defeat. But I felt no triumph in his silence. Instead, I felt a solemn resolve. This was not about vengeance, it was about justice. About reclaiming the future stolen from me. And about proving, to myself, to Jonathan, to Cynthia, and to everyone who had doubted me, that a woman broken could rise again. Later that evening, as I stood alone on the balcony overlooking the city, the weight of the day settled upon me. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. I whispered a vow to the night sky. This company is mine. This life is mine. And I will fight for them both until my last breath. The first morning as CEO dawned with a weight heavier than any I had carried before. The city below buzzed with life and energy, but inside Blake Technologies, a different kind of storm was brewing. This was no longer just about reclaiming a title. It was about healing a fractured company, and, in many ways, healing myself. I arrived at headquarters early, the familiar hum of the building both comforting and daunting. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint echo of hurried footsteps and whispered conversations. Employees passed by, their eyes flickering with cautious curiosity or barely concealed skepticism. Walking through the corridors, I caught glimpses of faces etched with exhaustion, uncertainty, even resentment. The company I once helped nurture was now a landscape scarred by neglect and conflict. But I was determined to breathe life back into it. My first order of business was assembling a leadership team I could trust, a group of capable, passionate individuals who believed in the vision I had outlined. Many had been overlooked or marginalized under Jonathan's rule. Now, they were ready for change. Sarah, the sharp senior manager who had stood by me through clandestine meetings, was appointed Chief Operations Officer. Her fierce loyalty and deep understanding of the company's inner workings made her invaluable. I brought in new talent as well, experts in innovation, finance, and human resources, people who could challenge the status quo and drive transformation. We spent hours in the war room, brainstorming strategies, identifying weaknesses, and setting priorities. Transparency became our mantra. We held town halls, inviting employees to voice concerns and share ideas. Slowly, trust began to rebuild. Yet, rebuilding a company was more than just processes and policies. It was about people. I soon realized that beneath the professional exterior, many carried wounds deeper than I had imagined. Conversations with longtime employees revealed stories of burnout, betrayal, and fear. Fears that the company they loved might collapse, or that leadership changes would bring instability. One afternoon, I met with Marcus, a talented developer who had once been my protégé. His eyes betrayed both hope and skepticism. "Can we really change things?" he asked quietly. "Or is this just another chapter in the same story?" I looked him in the eye and answered honestly, "This time it's different. Because we're building it together. And I won't let us fail." His tentative smile was the first of many small victories. But not all battles were external. Jonathan's shadow loomed large, and Cynthia's betrayal cut deeper than I let on. The knowledge that my former best friend still wielded influence in certain circles was a constant thorn. One evening, a message appeared on my phone. "You don't belong here anymore. Walk away before it gets ugly." No signature, but the threat was clear. I folded the message slowly, a cold fury rising inside me. This was no longer just about business. It was war on every front. Balancing the demands of leadership with the ghosts of my past tested me like never before. There were moments of doubt, of exhaustion, when the weight of expectations pressed down mercilessly. Yet, each time I stumbled, I reminded myself why I had fought so hard to return. Not just for Blake Technologies, but for me, for the woman who refused to be broken. Late nights in the office became routine. Surrounded by blueprints, contracts, and endless reports, I fought battles both seen and unseen. Every decision was scrutinized, every misstep magnified. But slowly, results emerged. Client relationships healed, revenue stabilized. Innovations began to spark. The company was breathing again, and so was I. As the city lights glittered through the windows one sleepless night, I allowed myself a rare moment of reflection. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but for the first time in years, I felt unstoppable. Because I was no longer just reclaiming a company, I was reclaiming my life. And nothing would ever take it from me again. The night air was thick with anticipation as I walked up the steps of the exclusive gala held at the city's most prestigious hotel. Blake Technologies was hosting the event, a celebration of innovation and a showcase of the company's rebirth. But beneath the glittering chandeliers and polished smiles, tension simmered like a coiled snake waiting to strike. Tonight was more than a celebration. It was a battlefield cloaked in elegance. Jonathan stood at the far end of the grand ballroom, a glass of whiskey in hand, his gaze sharp and calculating. His presence was magnetic and menacing, the embodiment of everything I had fought against, and everything I intended to overcome. When our eyes met across the room, the air crackled with years of betrayal, anger, and unspoken words. I approached with steady steps, my heart pounding with a mixture of dread and determination. "Jonathan," I said, my voice calm but carrying the weight of all that had passed. He smiled, a cold, practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You shouldn't have come back," he said quietly, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him. "I didn't come back to ask permission," I replied. "I came back to take what's mine." Our exchange was brief but electric, a silent war waged in words. The evening unfolded with speeches and presentations, but I remained hyper-aware of Cynthia's presence. She was there too, flawless and poised, the image of the woman who had shattered my life with a smile. Her eyes met mine across the crowd, and for a moment, the past threatened to consume me. But I held my ground. Later, in a quiet corner of the ballroom, I met with key investors and allies. The conversations were strategic, each word chosen carefully to build alliances and strengthen my position. Sarah was by my side, her steady support a reminder that I was no longer alone. Together, we mapped out plans to expand into new markets, invest in groundbreaking technologies, and solidify Blake Technologies' standing as an industry leader. But outside the gala's glitz, darker moves were in motion. Anonymous threats, sabotage attempts on new projects, and whispers of corporate espionage surfaced. The battle was no longer just in the boardroom. It was on every front. One night, I found my office ransacked, files missing, computers tampered with. The message was clear: I was being tested, but I would not back down. The personal toll was immense. Old wounds reopened, trust shattered in my personal relationships, and nights filled with restless thoughts. Yet, every challenge steeled my resolve. I was no longer the woman who had been broken by betrayal. I was a phoenix, rising from the ashes, fierce and unyielding. The war for Blake Technologies had only just begun, but this time I was ready to fight, with fire in my heart and steel in my soul. The game had changed, but the stakes remained as high as ever. Blake Technologies was no longer just a company. It was a battleground where every decision carried the weight of survival, revenge, and redemption. And like any great strategist, I knew that to win, I had to think several moves ahead. My mornings began early, often before dawn. The city skyline glowed faintly through the windows as I pored over reports, emails, and intelligence from my trusted team. Every whisper of dissent, every rumor of sabotage, every market shift was analyzed, weighed, and turned into a tactical advantage. Jonathan and Cynthia were formidable opponents, cunning, ruthless, and deeply entrenched in the company's fabric. But I had one advantage they underestimated. I was not fighting out of fear or desperation. I was fighting with purpose and clarity. One of my first moves was to secure the loyalty of key departments: research and development, sales, and finance. I introduced incentive programs, transparency initiatives, and open forums to rebuild trust and morale. Employees who had been silenced or sidelined under Jonathan's leadership found their voices again. Sarah, ever my right hand, spearheaded a revitalized innovation task force, pushing the boundaries of technology with projects that captured the industry's attention. Together, we unveiled new prototypes that promised to revolutionize our market segment and undercut Jonathan's remaining influence. But the fight was not only on the business front. I knew Jonathan and Cynthia would strike where it hurt most: my reputation, my personal relationships, and my vulnerabilities. A well-placed media leak hinted at scandal, casting shadows over my integrity. Anonymous emails threatened to expose fabricated secrets. I was forced to navigate a maze of public relations crises while maintaining a steely public image. Yet, through it all, I grew stronger. I sought counsel from mentors and allies, building a network that extended beyond Blake Technologies. From industry veterans to legal experts, I surrounded myself with wisdom and protection. One late evening, Sarah and I sat in my office, reviewing the latest market analytics. The city lights twinkled below, but inside, the atmosphere was charged with determination. "We're turning the tide," she said, eyes bright with optimism. I nodded, feeling a surge of pride mixed with the familiar hunger for more. This is just the beginning. Jonathan and Cynthia don't realize it yet, but their time is running out. Personal growth paralleled professional triumphs. Therapy sessions deepened my self-awareness, teaching me to harness emotions rather than be ruled by them. Meditation and physical training built resilience, making me unbreakable in mind and body. I learned to trust again, cautiously allowing a few close friends into my inner circle. Relationships that had once been casualties of my pain began to heal, reminding me that strength also came from connection. The chessboard was set, pieces in motion, and I was playing to win. The tension in the conference room was palpable as I took my seat at the head of the table. The faces around me were a mix of anticipation, guarded optimism, and, for some, barely concealed doubt. This meeting was different. It was the moment where months of planning, strategy, and resilience would either pay off or unravel. Today, we were unveiling Blake Technologies' most ambitious project yet, a groundbreaking innovation designed not only to reclaim market dominance, but to redefine the future of the industry. Sarah began the presentation with precision, unveiling data that dazzled and proposals that inspired. The room leaned in, captivated. I watched their reactions carefully, noting who was persuaded, who remained skeptical. When it was my turn, I spoke with conviction, laying out not just the technical aspects, but the vision and the heart behind the project. I reminded everyone of the company's origins, the values we stood for, and the brighter future we were building together. As I spoke, I felt the energy in the room shift. Doubts gave way to belief. Resistance softened into support. But just as victory seemed within reach, a late-breaking development threatened to topple everything. An urgent message arrived. A critical leak had exposed sensitive project details to a rival firm. The breach was devastating, months of work potentially compromised, and a threat to investor confidence. Jonathan's influence was behind it. His network was ruthless, willing to sabotage at any cost. The crisis demanded swift, decisive action. I called an emergency meeting with the security, legal, and PR teams. Strategies were crafted to contain the leak, protect intellectual property, and reassure stakeholders. Through the chaos, Sarah's calm leadership anchored us. Together, we devised contingency plans to accelerate development timelines and reinforce security protocols. The battle was fierce, and the toll was heavy. Long nights blurred into early mornings. The pressure tested every ounce of my resolve. Amid the turmoil, a personal betrayal cut deep. I discovered that a close confidant had been compromised, leaking information for personal gain. The revelation shook me, a painful reminder of the cost of trust. Yet, in the crucible of adversity, I found unexpected strength. I confronted the betrayal not with anger alone, but with clarity and resolve, making difficult decisions to protect the company and myself. Weeks later, despite the setback, Blake Technologies launched the innovation to overwhelming acclaim. Market shares surged, investor confidence soared, and the company's reputation was restored and elevated. Jonathan's influence waned further, his efforts to undermine us exposed and thwarted. Standing on the stage at the launch event, bathed in spotlight and applause, I felt a profound mixture of triumph and loss. The journey had demanded sacrifice, of trust, comfort, and parts of my old self. But it had also forged a new me, stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever lay ahead. The war for Blake Technologies was far from over. But in this moment, in this victory, I knew the tides had turned, and the future was mine to shape. The glass doors of the private conference suite slid open with a muted hiss, revealing a room bathed in soft, ambient light. The air was thick with anticipation, every breath charged with the weight of unspoken history. This was where everything would come to a head. Jonathan sat at the head of the long table, his posture rigid, eyes cold and calculating. Across from him, Cynthia's poised demeanor barely concealed the smug satisfaction she carried like armor. Together, they were the embodiment of the past I had fought so fiercely to overcome. But I was no longer the woman they thought they knew. As I stepped inside, the sound of my heels clicking against the polished floor echoed like a drumbeat, a herald of change. "Welcome back." Jonathan's voice was low, a mixture of sarcasm and challenge. "I see you're playing the game seriously." I met his gaze steadily. "I'm here to finish what we started. To take back what you stole." Cynthia smiled, but it was sharp, edged with venom. "You should have stayed gone. This isn't your world anymore." Their words were weapons, but I was shielded by years of pain, growth, and unyielding resolve. The meeting began with thinly veiled attempts to undermine me, accusations of instability, questions about my leadership, reminders of my absence. But I met each attack with facts, data, and unshakable confidence. I revealed new strategic alliances forged during my absence, innovative projects set to disrupt markets, and financial maneuvers that secured investor loyalty. The board members listened, some with surprise, others with grudging respect. Slowly, the tide shifted. At one point, Jonathan leaned forward, voice low and threatening. "You think you can undo everything? You're playing with fire." I smiled coldly. "I'm the one who controls the flame now." The room fell into a heavy silence, the kind that signals the end of an era. After hours of tense negotiation, the board voted decisively. Jonathan was stripped of executive privileges. Cynthia's role was marginalized, her influence curtailed. I was reinstated as CEO, this time with unequivocal authority. Walking out of that room, the weight of victory was bittersweet. The battle had taken everything from us: relationships, trust, and innocence. But it had also forged a future born from resilience. Later that evening, alone in my office, I allowed myself a rare moment of reflection. The scars of betrayal were still there, but so was a fierce pride. I had faced my demons and emerged victorious. The war was far from over, but I was ready. Because this time, I was not just fighting for a company. I was fighting for my life, for my dignity, for my destiny. The first rays of dawn crept gently through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office, casting long golden streaks across the polished wood and glass. Outside, the city stirred awake, the hum of life and possibility weaving into the soft morning air. Inside, I sat alone, a moment stolen from the chaos, reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. It had been a long, grueling battle, one marked by betrayal, loss, and moments when hope felt like a distant flicker. But today, that flicker was a blazing flame. Blake Technologies was no longer just a company struggling to find its footing. It was a testament to resilience, innovation, and leadership forged in the crucible of adversity. Revenues had soared beyond projections, new markets were opening, and the spirit of collaboration and trust was being restored within the walls I once called home. My leadership was no longer questioned. It was respected, and in some corners, even admired. Yet, the greatest victory was not the numbers on the balance sheet or the accolades from the industry. It was the healing, personal and collective, that had begun to take root. I had reached out to former employees who had felt abandoned, offering apologies, listening deeply, and creating spaces where their voices could be heard. Together, we crafted initiatives to foster wellness, growth, and empowerment. The culture was shifting, from fear and distrust to one of transparency and shared purpose. But rebuilding a company was only one part of my redemption. The scars Jonathan and Cynthia left on my heart were deeper, more complicated. Forgiveness had seemed impossible, a luxury I could not afford. But I learned that forgiveness was not about them. It was about freeing myself from the chains of resentment. Therapy, meditation, and new relationships slowly helped me reclaim my sense of self beyond the pain. One evening, as I walked through the city park, the cool breeze carrying the scent of blooming jasmine, I met Michael, a man whose kindness and understanding gently chipped away my walls. Our connection was gradual, built on shared values and quiet moments. He did not rush me, nor expect me to forget my past. Instead, he offered companionship, a safe harbor amid the storms of life. With him, I learned that strength could coexist with vulnerability. At a company gala celebrating our recent milestones, I stood before colleagues, friends, and investors, a leader transformed. I spoke of the journey, the battles fought, and the future we were building together. When I finished, the applause was thunderous, a powerful affirmation of how far we had come. As the night wore on, I found a quiet moment on the balcony, the city lights sparkling below like a constellation of dreams fulfilled. I whispered to myself, I am no longer defined by what was taken. I am the author of my own story. And this is only the beginning. The empire I rebuilt was not just mine to command. It was a beacon. Proof that from the deepest betrayal, the fiercest fires of rebirth and triumph could rise. And I was ready to lead it, strong, wise, and unbreakable. The morning sun filtered softly through the sheer curtains of my new home, a space filled with light, warmth, and carefully chosen mementos that told the story of a life reclaimed. The gentle hum of the city waking up was a comforting soundtrack, one that no longer carried echoes of pain but whispered of hope. I stood by the window, a steaming cup of coffee warming my hands, and breathed deeply. This was a moment I had fought for, the quiet after the storm, the calm that comes not from escape but from victory and peace. Blake Technologies had flourished under my leadership, growing beyond even my boldest dreams. But success was no longer measured only by profits or market share. It was about people. The dedicated team who had believed in a shared vision, the clients who trusted us to innovate responsibly, and the communities we now supported through outreach and sustainability programs. I had learned that true leadership was as much about empathy as it was about strategy. In my personal life, healing had blossomed into joy. Michael remained a steady presence, not a savior but a partner walking beside me, celebrating victories and sharing quiet moments. With him, I rediscovered the simple pleasures of companionship: long walks, shared laughter, and dreams whispered beneath star-studded skies. Trust had grown slowly, nurtured by honesty and respect. I no longer feared vulnerability. Instead, I embraced it as a source of strength. The ghosts of the past had not vanished, but they no longer controlled me. I had forgiven, not to forget, but to free myself. Forgiveness had been the final key to my transformation, unlocking a peace I had long sought but never believed possible. One afternoon, I visited a community center where Blake Technologies sponsored workshops for young women aspiring to careers in technology and leadership. Watching their eager faces, bright with possibility, I felt a profound sense of purpose. I shared my story, not just the triumphs, but the struggles and setbacks. I wanted them to know that failure was not the end, but a beginning. That resilience was built in the moments when we chose to rise. Their applause was humbling, a reminder that my journey was no longer mine alone. As twilight painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, I walked through my garden, the scent of jasmine wrapping around me like a gentle embrace. I paused and looked up at the stars beginning to twinkle. A soft smile curved my lips. My life was no longer defined by betrayal or loss. It was a story of rebirth, of courage, and relentless hope. And as I stepped forward into the unknown, I knew this was only the beginning of a new adventure, one written by my own hand, with strength, grace, and unshakable faith.